Hello and welcome. My name is Beth Megill, Language of Dance Master Practitioner, and I'm here talking with Dr. Marissa Nesbit, whom I'm so honored to talk with because, hello, like brilliance coming out of your ears, Marissa. And I mean, from the moment I met you, like I was like, who is this woman and how is she so amazing? So Marissa um, has been working with language of dance since I think 2011. Or no, before that, long before that. So it's been a long road. Just got your master practitioner um, as well, and studied, got graduate degrees from Texas Women's University and a PhD from Ohio State, and now teaching at University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And really, your passion and your work and what one aspect of your work is your amazing perspective on dance education as a whole. And and I love that you know you talk in your bio about dance education methods, because I think that we tend to think of it's one way or the highway, right? It's my way or the highway, and to think that there are actually different approaches and that one person might have different approaches to meet different needs is maybe new for some people. So yes, welcome, 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 and thank you for being here with me and sharing your story. So to start, tell people a little bit about your inroad to language of dance and or dance notation as a whole, right? Dance literacy notation, because I know that you are also experienced in structured notation. And so that changes the perspective and the entry points. I'd love to hear more.
Yeah. So my first exposure to structured notation was as a master's MFA student at Texas Women's University in early 2000s. And at the time, we had a lot of overlapping Laban studies classes in our curriculum. So I took effort shape and space harmony back when those were offered as separate courses, and then also had the option to take elementary and intermediate Laban notation with Dr. Penny Hanstein. And I came to those classes, just really in a place where I was really confused about what I wanted to do. And I actually fell in love with it because it was one of the things that seemed very clear cut and really appealed to the analytical thinking. And I often felt like maybe if I had found that sooner, I would have taken a different path. Like I would have gone into reconstructions
Mm-hmm.
with notation as a bigger part of my master's degree. But I did a little independent project reconstructing a Doris Humphrey piece, just kind of for fun. Uh,
For fun.
for fun. When I was
Or
there, I wasn't super good at it, but I loved it. I just thought it was an interesting way of thinking, and I would just notate things on the side. And so that was kind of my first dip in, and then it was in probably around like 2005, 6. I was here in Charlotte at that point. I was the education and outreach director for what was then the North Carolina Dance Theater. It's now Charlotte Ballet. We
okay.
had a lot of teaching projects with different school and community partners. And I had a team of teaching artists that taught for those, but I myself would teach some of them as well, just depending on how scheduling went, and a lot of them were focused on arts integration. And so I had a couple of projects where I was working with elementary teachers on integrating dance and math, and I ended up using a lot of the symbol vocabulary from structured notation in ways to create, like I did one project that was based on space harmony and building the octahedron and icosahedron with some 5th grade students who were really strong in math, and they latched on to the geometric nature of it and to the pattern making nature of using the directional symbols. And then I had another project where we were creating floor plans and using the directional symbols and some of the other vocabulary to create stage floor plans and superimpose them on Cartesian coordinates, because they were learning about mapping coordinates. And I was doing all of this just kind of experimenting with the vocabulary that I knew from structured notation. I took the staff away, but I didn't really know that there was this whole other approach to motif notation. I hadn't encountered that. And then it was in 2007 that I got, probably on NDEO listserv or something, an announcement of the classes that Susan Gingrasso was hosting in Wisconsin. And at the time, I was then working for an organization in Tennessee, and I had access to some professional development funding. And they actually just went ahead and paid for me to go for the 3 weeks to Wisconsin. And we were in that like weird little hotel near campus, and I was taking the stage 1 module. And it was still very theory driven, but I love the fact that there was like, oh, we took away the 3-line staff, and then we have these symbols that can convey a whole conceptual basis of meaning, rather than having to be super specific about a certain body part or a certain timing, that we could be more open and conceptual. And I think that was such an aha moment for me in thinking about the idea of families and a movement concept and a movement concept family, which was a much more eloquent way of introducing it with children and working in an arts integrated model. And it was what I had been trying to do, but just didn't quite have the framework for doing it on my own, right?
Well, exactly. Yeah. I'm gonna chime in just because for people who might not be familiar with the difference between structured and motif, structured notation has this 3-lined staff, which Marissa talked about, and the center line, that center line is the center line of the body, and then we divide into right and left sides, and that gives us then columns of different body parts and different portions of different body parts that then allow us to be very specific about, how my arm is angled and folded and in space, right? So I can be very, very specific in that 3-lined staff. So structured notation, 3-lined staff. And then motif notation, we take away those 3 lines and it becomes, for me, more like poetry, where I can now shift things in unexpected relationships, and there's a lot more flexibility about where things can go, why they can go there, how they're expressed, how they're interpreted. So just a little bit of background for somebody who might be new to the work and thinking, well, what is the difference? I thought that they were all the same. And they are linked, strongly linked, but that's one of the distinctions. Please continue.
Yeah, so that idea of the family trees and the conceptual organizing in LOD, and then also the idea that you don't have to notate every single aspect. You notate for what you've determined is important, and it's the mover might determine it, or the notator might determine it, or you might have, right now this is important and I'm going to notate for this, and right now this is important, I'm going to notate for this. And so that kind of flexibility really opens up so many possibilities for working with it in a pedagogical sense, and working with it in ways that are a little more open and accessible. So I just kept building on that. And then when I ended up at Ohio State doing my doctorate, I was actually in art education, but I took classes in the dance department as well. And because why not? And when you're at Ohio State and you can, I was like, well, I guess I'll just take advanced lob notation because I can. My advisor's like, why are you doing this? I'm like, because when else can you? When opportunities present themselves to do it. So I took a couple classes with Sheila Marion. I did a project with her where I observed her teaching of intro to notation and kind of compared and contrasted it with my own experiences, just as sort of a pedagogical thought exercise. And then also took score reading and advanced lob notation and did the DNB teacher cert. Interestingly, I got away with doing my DNB teacher cert all with motif.
I know. I came after you, and I remember looking at the prior projects. I'm like, hey, right? Because I did that after I had done my language of dance. So I was like, what's this doing?
And what it was Sheila was great. Like, create something that's useful to you and what's going to be the most useful. And I was like, at this point, motif feels more useful. And I still like working with things in structured notation when it comes up, but it doesn't come up as often for me. But as a an interesting exercise for me, and just sort of thinking about what's happening here in this movement, what ideas come up, how am I understanding this movement. It was interesting. And then while I was at Ohio State, I got to go and met Tina and Rachel, who's now my LOD sister, because Rachel and I did a week intensive in New York with Tina that just happened one summer while I was also at Ohio State, to work on some of the other material in LOD. And that was just, there's the material, but then there's also just these rich conversations that happen when you're studying it and you're working out with someone. You're like, well, what did you see here? How did you solve this? How did you approach this? So I approached this, but now I'm thinking of it this way, but then I'm stuck when I get here. Oh, but you're thinking of it this way. I can help you with that. You can help me with that. So Rachel and I really just bounced a ton of ideas off of each other. And Tina was revising some teaching materials, so we were contributing to that in little ways and stuff like that. So I've just continued to use LOD concepts as they seem relevant in different things that I'm teaching. And always this question of, what does this vocabulary allow me to explore? What does it allow me to do? What does it allow me to explain or to understand in a way that that supports the teaching goal or the goal in a particular context? So I've never been in a situation where I've had the opportunity to just teach a straight notation or a straight movement analysis class. That's not part of the curriculum in any place I've taught, but I have had lots of opportunities to weave it in different ways across different teaching projects.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. Just this past week, I went into a theater class. And I was talking about movement and expression, right? So, and it wasn't an LOD class, but I brought in a couple of movement alphabet cards, and I said, here are these symbols, and I'm sharing with you that there's this language and this framework for understanding movement. Not for you to memorize these symbols today, but to know that this is what informs how I do my work. So what I'm going to offer you today is shaped by my studying of this system. And so if you're interested in the approach that I have, if you're interested in the premise on which we're going to build this experience, then come talk to me about this work, because I wouldn't be able to teach I wouldn't be able to lead this particular experience without having gone through that system of training and reflection and all of those, like you said, the conversations of, oh, I'm ready to crack open my definition of what a developé is now, like I will never see it again as the same thing. And so once that's cracked open, it's like you can't stuff it back in the box, because now the way that we see movement is forever changed, like transformed. And so I like to let people know that this is what brought me to the work, even if I'm not teaching an LOD class. And yeah, I think that now the curriculum really has been flipped on its head, where we've moved away from the pedagogy of teaching the theory for the theory, but teaching the theory as an access point for bigger objectives, learning objectives. So that's definitely becoming more of a common practice.
And I also like it because, with the families and the ideas, you can just take one concept and you can understand a little bit about that concept, and then you can use it right away. It's not like you have to understand 10 different things in order to be able to read a simple dance or write a simple dance, right? And in some ways now, some days I use more things that are more reading and writing heavy, and some days it's more, I'm using that concept and some of the verbal language around it, but we might not get to a point in a class where we are writing symbols or where we're creating scores. I'm not always in situations that get to that place, and I think that's okay, because of the flexibility. But it's also, for me as a facilitator, having gone through that process, I can think, okay, if I was to create a score, what would I need? Okay, if I was to write, what would I need? What would my participants need to know? Because it's a very holistic basis that you're building from, even if in any one instance you don't pull on all of the literacy processes and all the symbols and everything, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I forget where we were going with questions.
Well, no, just the application and the nature of the application, and there are so few people teaching theory for theory, right? And I don't even think the people who are teaching theory, like when I teach an LOD class, I don't even know, am I teaching theory for theory, or am I don't know if I'm even doing that there, right, anymore. I think that we've shifted that paradigm, that there's just there's just such a few of us who are like, give me the intellect. Like,
Yeah.
I want my Sudoku puzzle dance version. I want my dance version of a Sudoku puzzle right now, right here, right now. Which it can be that, and that can be very fulfilling for a lot, for at least some of us. But I think as a culture, we've really moved beyond that, and but I don't know if the outside perception, those who haven't had an experience with the work yet, know that, right?
Mhm.
Know that's a cultural shift that's happened within. And so I think, I was just talking with Nicole Robinson and Kim Hoy the other day on another one of these, and Nicole said, I thought it was going to be this whole other thing that I would have to learn, and I have so many things already, and they work, and I'm like, why do I have to learn another thing? And then right, so then we were talking about, actually it wasn't another thing. It was this sort of scaffolding on which to hang what she already does. That
Mhm.
it was like, it's like a buoy for bringing salient points to the surface. It sort of floats up what, the vocabulary we want our students to use in conversation with each other, with themselves, with us, about dance as an art, as a practice, as an expression. It allows conversations for growth to happen really directly and clearly when we share a language. So it was an interesting conversation in that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, any other thoughts?
Well, I guess, you had asked about like teaching applications and projects and stuff that I've done. And I mean, there are a whole lot. I would say, even though I've studied the system, through the whole book or whatever, it tends to be the more simplified versions of the symbols and the concepts that I use the most. In part because I'm mainly working with people who are having an introductory experience, in one way or another, right?
Mhm.
But for me personally, one thing that made all the difference in both structured notation and motif is understanding musicality, because I really find music to be extremely challenging, like extremely challenging. So as a teenager, I I was always late. You're going across the floor, and I could never figure out how to get started. I never wanted to go first because I wouldn't know when, not that I didn't know the phrase, I didn't know when to start, and even when to come in, when to join in. I mean, I remember being in ballet class at like 14, and I was like, why does the teacher sometimes count to 6 and sometimes count to 8?
Yeah.
I don't get it. And like fundamentally, I really didn't. And so then in a lot of notation, if you're gonna land on the beat and you're counting it, 1, 2, 3, 4, then you have to notate the airlines, right? Or the
Airtime.
airtime, right, ahead, and then the landing is on the beat. And because there was this really clear visual representation of when beats happen and then when actions happen in relation to the beats, it was like, I mean, it seems so silly, but like this aha moment that if I'm going to land on 1, I have to jump on the and of the 8, and that the and is actually part of the 8, not part of the 1.
Right.
Right, like where does the and go? And so, and even something like, and I'm not a ballet person, not very good at ballet, could not do this at all today, but like notating pointe turns, you notate pirouettes, and then you learn how to notate pointe turns, and you're like, oh, what's the order of when things happen? When does the support leg bend? When does the gesture leg go forward? When does the gesture leg go side? When does the turn get initiated? And how does, and really breaking that down. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is and of course that's a very specific example, but that idea of representing time visually. And that's been something that's really stuck with me. So I was thinking today before we chatted about like some of my favorite LOD lessons. And honestly, one of them is very much inspired by Anne. Right. Like, I mean, all of them are, but I remember, I want to say it was like 2007, 6, somewhere in there at a NDEO, maybe in Long Beach. I don't know. They all blend together after a while. But I remember she did a session and really the action line was like the only symbol we used. And I was like, wait, how did this woman just do this entire long thing? And it was one symbol.
Right.
And it kept us busy and engaged and making stuff. Maybe we had stillness. I think we might have had stillness too.
Probably,
but, and just playing with variation of duration. And so I've done a lot of things that are kind of based on that idea of like action and stillness, and then using duration lines as rhythmic notation. And for me, you know, I've been collaborating with a musician who he's a music director in our department, and he accompanies for my improv class, and then he also teaches a music and dance class. So I've gone in and done some guest teaching in music and dance. And because of a lesson he saw me do in improv, where I was just kind of playing with like, how many ways can we divide like 8 beats and find a pulse and then subdivide it, and having the students create rhythmic patterns by notating and moving in this back and forth way. And then we did it in the music and dance class, and I actually had them taking their duration line. I brought a whole box of scissors and I made them cut, like literally. I was like, no, you have to do this tangibly with your own self.
Wonderful.
Yes. Right. This represents 4.
Yep.
And now you're going to cut it in half. And now you got 2. How much does each of them represent? And then what they had to do is they had to turn it sideways and flip it over and write like a whole note would correspond in our case to 4, and then flip the others and what note goes on the back end. So they were writing the musical notation on the back. And so then they would create a little dance phrase, and then they would flip it over and they would have the music notation that matched it. Because
brilliant,
me, you know, and for some of the students who grew up with music, they were like, this is so basic. I'm like, yeah. But for the person who didn't grow up understanding music, I was always so very confused, because a half note doesn't look like half of a whole note.
No, there's no visual.
You know, and then you get a quarter note, but you just like went and added a flag to it. So you added something.
Add a flag.
How is this more than how is this less than this? You know, and so yes, like cognitively, I can memorize what those symbols mean.
And you have to, because there's no other.
That's how you have to do. But the thing that I like about dance notation is that particular aspect is so very visual. This is half of this. This takes half as much time, and we organize it, you know, in the same way. So for some of the students, that was a really interesting way of thinking. And then for beginning to compose musically, they're comfortable composing kinesthetically, but not as comfortable composing musically. But hey, look, you just actually did both, and you have the notation here to prove it. So that's been kind of a fun way of playing with it and thinking through it, and having that dialogue back and forth with the musician, which is, you know, and then we can move on and do things in triple meter, right? Because it's still going to reflect relative timing and all that. So that's been one that's been really fun for me to play with.
I love that. Yeah, and I think that your the gift of having that exchange of a live musician, right, still in the room, is now less and less available broadly, right? And of course, in local studios, I think it's absent. And then many, I would say, even many 4 years probably don't really have a live musician anymore. I mean, I hope that I hope it's going to resurge. I hope it's going to swing back into that direction. Because those conversations and being able to speak that same language, right, is really powerful. I haven't done I've certainly done duration strips, but I haven't done then copy down the music notation. That's so fun. I love that.
It's kind of a fun way to do it. And I think later we might even build it into having them make musical compositions out of that and kind of back and forth
Mm-hmm.
playing. Because I think when you play, even if it's just a simple percussion instrument, you start to have a different kind of relationship to the patterns you're working with. And for me, so much of what I want my students to get out of their time in college is just sort of being exposed to lots of different tools and lots of different ways to conceptualize this big question of what is knowledge in dance,
Yeah.
right? Like that's a huge question. And
The
if
question in many ways,
right, and
right?
so how all these different ways that we can conceptualize that and have different tools for investigating that,
Mm-hmm.
and then out of that sort of define our own practice, and like you said earlier, I don't want my students to teach my lesson, I want them to teach their lesson.
Yeah.
But here's some different things we can explore. um,
So cool. So in terms of so current research, what you always have stuff in the fire, right? You're always, and you say it so lightly, like, oh yeah, then I just kind of played with mapping it on Cartesian coordinates, and like that sort of abstract thinking is really out of the realm
mm,
for for some for some individuals, right? Um, who it's like dance is in the studio at in a spot, in my spot, or on the floor, and it's it's rich and wonderful in my sensory experience, but it's maybe not making connections beyond, like it's like stays in the dance room kind of,
mm.
is what I've occasionally witnessed, right? And so I keep encouraging my students, like, making, the more you can make connections to whatever class you're taking at the time, like that's the value. um and so I want to underscore like how remarkable that is, because it's not a simple thing, and I think that takes practice as well. Just practice, like, how could you connect these two disparate things? How could you connect these? And often the link is conceptual.
It really, really is. And I think, there's a push, like in my college right now, we're the College of Arts and Architecture. And in our new strategic plan, there's a huge push for interdisciplinarity,
Mm.
right? With a college, we've been operating as really distinct departments. And in this new era, we're looking at ways to connect across departments. I think a lot of places have that as an aim, and it can be very, very difficult to do. But like we literally just had this conversation 2 days ago with our dean about this, right? So it's fresh in the brain. But for me also, so going back, so in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a huge push in arts education in the K-12 landscapes for arts integration.
Right.
And pre-2008 especially, a lot of funding to arts organizations was tied to their education programming.
Yes.
And that was how I got started. I mean, I came out of my MFA and like, okay, I had all this theory, but I didn't really know like what to do with it.
Mhm.
And I hadn't been exposed in my own training to comprehensive dance education in K-12. So I didn't really understand that that was like a thing.
Right.
Um, and it was through working for arts organizations that partnered with public schools, right? And so we were always asked to do arts integration, and there was a bit of a sinister subtext, as in we want the arts to bump up the math scores and we want the arts to bump up the writing scores, which I have a lot of philosophical problems with. But that was the foot in the door, right?
Yeah.
To get to work with schools. And then really a huge push to get to work with teachers, because the idea being that you really want to train teachers to understand to work with the arts. And so for several years I worked for an arts organization in Tennessee that was part of a university, and our mandate was largely centered around training classroom educators in arts integration.
Right.
But we all had art backgrounds, like everybody had a graduate degree in their art form. We weren't about to subsume that to the reading scores, right? So the model that we worked from was conceptually framed integration. So it was very much look at what are concepts that are surfacing in the art form and what are concepts that are present in the other content area that you want to work with, right? And then by defining that concept and looking at what each content area could promote understanding and how each content area would understand that concept, and how by putting them together, the students could increase the depth and understanding of that concept, right?
Love it.
So it was a really rich model, and it obviously required that we teach dance from a conceptual point of view. And so that's one of the things I love about LOD, because it fits in with that so nicely and allows us to say, well, what's the bigger idea here? And to start to identify the bigger ideas. And then so much of what we've done in our LOD conversations has been metaphorical in nature, right? So like my favorite one is the relationships and the progression of relating. That's my favorite thing to teach. I just submitted a proposal to teach a thing about that at a workshop, but is looking at it's not just here or there, but that idea of approaching and retreating. And I love playing with nearness because it gets overlooked a lot. Right?
Oh, there's so much like potential and
Right.
expectation
And
and like, whoa!
when you talk about coaching actors, it's
Oh,
like, no, you don't have to touch. You don't even have to touch. And you can have this really charged relationship if you think about the space between you as having its own life. Right. So anyway, but all of the things about, well, what does it mean to be supporting someone, and what does it mean to be near someone, and how do we feel about that? And one of my favorite lessons that I ever did was a project with third graders who were reading a novel because of Winn-Dixie. It's a great story about community and about the dog that brings a community together.
yeah.
And we had gone through the forms of relating in a simplified way, and then we talked about pairs of characters, this character and this character. At the beginning of the novel, which form of relating do you think they are, and why? Oh, these two are away, and this is why they're away. But they get near. They never get to support. These two don't get to these two get to support, and the kids were like using that language in this really rich way. And again, it was because the LOD work invites you to think conceptually. It invites you to think about the larger idea of relationships, and then in that case, towards community, right? As opposed to just a skill of working together or making this shape with our bodies or doing this lift or doing this step. So really thinking conceptually. And once you start thinking that way, I find that it lets new ideas just kind of bubble up, and it lets you see them where they could be. So here's another fun thing.
It's like magic.
It really is. So
No?
so the other day I totally made a lesson in 10 minutes right before class. So
I've never done that.
So one of the classes I teach is secondary methods. So it's officially dance education methods for the secondary school, and it's one of the licensure requirements for our students.
Gotcha.
And it's focused on teaching strategies for 6th through 12th grade. And a big component of that course is getting at culturally responsive teaching, and that bigger question of how do we make our teaching accessible and relevant to learners from backgrounds that are different from our own.
It's the question of our age right now. I mean,
right. And so I had them reading, some theory around that, and they relate to that. But there's only so far that theory takes you, especially when you're an overwhelmed undergrad. So one of the things that I found is that stories really resonate with all people, but with my undergrad students, and that idea of envisioning yourself in a different situation, envision the life of someone different. And because of the nature of timing and schedules, they go and they work in a school, but they're only there for an hour a week. They don't form super tight relationships with a lot of the children that they work with, just because there's not enough time in the course of the semester for that. So they have an assignment where they have to read a young adult novel that engages with a protagonist whose cultural context is different than their own. Brilliant. So it could be the protagonist is a different race or gender or ethnicity or immigration status or language or geography, anything like that. It's got to be contemporary, and there's got to be a cultural context that's outside of your familial comfort zone. And that's really, and then I have a list of books that I like, and they often pick up my list, but they can pick anything as long as it fits the criteria. And so there's a really wonderful book called I'm Not Dying With You Tonight. And I can look it up and send you the authors. And it's a two-voiced book, and it's written by two authors, and it follows a young Black woman and a young white woman who go to the same high school but don't really know each other. And it takes place over the course of one night, where there is a fight after a football game that bleeds into a protest or riot, depending on your point of view, in their city, and they get caught up in this, and it goes back and forth between the two characters and their point of view, and how they each are seeing the events of the evening unfold, and what they learn about each other and what they think about each other. And so one of my students had read this novel and was giving a little talk about it, and as my students were talking about the different things they read, I noticed a pattern that they would kind of get in this, well, you could, like, what could you do with this novel, right? How does it work or think about dance? And I was like, I gotta give them some more examples. And I was like, well, what would I do? Like, and this particular book in Charlotte was actually the community read for our local library system a couple of years ago. Nice. So a lot of people in our community have read this book. And I was like, if people had read this, and I wanted to build this into a dance lesson, and I really thought about the idea of how hard it truly is to listen to another person. Like, how often we have a conversation, we don't really listen because we're thinking about our own stuff.
Yeah, and what we're going to say next,
what we see,
what we need. So
I was like, I want to have them sort of metaphorically engage with that idea of how hard it is to see and listen to another person. But let's do it in a dance context. And then I was like, okay, how the heck do I set this up in 10 minutes, right?
This is your 10-minute lesson.
This is my 10-minute lesson, right? So like, how do I do all that in 10 minutes? And so I was like, okay, my trusty LOD.
That's when we go to it. We're like, what can I do?
So I was like, what is a way I can set them up? And then I was also, what's an LOD concept I haven't introduced to this group of students yet, just to give them more
variety.
So I did a super fast mini lesson on forms of rotation.
Oh,
yeah, it was still random, but I'll get there. So so we're looking at, turning right and left and cartwheeling and somersaulting. And these are very fit, and many turned out to be extremely acrobatic students that I have. And they had a prompt to create a short dance phrase that engaged as many forms of rotation as they could, right?
Okay.
So they're changing directions, and they're up, down, and axis is going everywhere.
Yeah. Axis is flying around the room.
It's a conceptually hard thing that you're thinking about doing, and it's one where your head doesn't stay in the same spot. So then the task was to find a partner, and you're gonna dance your dance, and your partner's gonna dance their dance, and you're gonna watch. And then after it was over, you had to write about your partner's dance. And they were like,
"What? How?
What?"
That's unreasonable.
Right. And so then the second layer was, your partner's going to dance and you can watch, but you have to stand as far away from them as you can. And you're going to, right. So you can see them, but you got everybody else doing all their stuff in the way. And then we backed out, and then it was a talk with your partner and have them tell you what's in their dance. And then the final iteration, you got to watch their dance just while you were doing nothing else, just watching. And so it took us into this larger discussion about how hard it is to focus on another person when you're thinking about yourself, and when you're filtering what you're watching that other person do through the lens of what you yourself are doing in that moment, and what your priorities are, and how, like, when you're turned away from them, how you just flat out couldn't see because of your own things. So it was just an interesting little, it wasn't even a full lesson. It was just like this mini lesson. But for me, that idea of LOD giving this, that openness and flexibility, that I could give them a quick prompt that would generate a movement activity that then could be used in this other way, to prompt this then thinking about relationships, and about how hard it is to view, and even metaphorically, this idea of like, what angle are we coming at, or where is our balance or our off balance when we're dialoguing with someone, and all those sorts of things, when we start engaging concepts like rotation as a concept, as opposed to how do I make my pirouette better as a skill, which is important in its own right. But in terms of what I was aiming for in my class was really about these setting up a scenario that would allow us to improvise and feel frustrated and work through it. And they knew I had something on my sleeve. They're like, you got it. You've got an end game here.
Yeah, of
So
course.
they were like,
You're
okay, we can go along for this, even though it's really hard as we unpacked what that was
Exactly.
like. And then they were thinking about how that could translate to conversations that they might do and experiences they might facilitate with their own high school students.
Yeah. Well, and I know you were picking concepts that you hadn't done with them before, but what's so fascinating about rotation as a metaphor for me is this idea that when we turn, we change our perspective, right? We see new things, and then like you said, taking the head off of the vertical axis really breaks open our sense of existing in the world in one way and only relating to our space in this like erect posture, right? And it I'm curious, like from the somatic perspective of
Mm.
having them disorient, like you get disoriented when you cartwheel and somersault and turn a lot. Like that's going to mess with your inner ear. And so it really shakes up whatever norm you
Mm-hmm.
might be bringing into the conversation because we've just gotten completely turned around, literally. so so what a beautiful, and maybe by chance, maybe by some subconscious design, on your part, but like that sort of preparatory movement experience that was not embedded with like heavy storytelling or like this has to be meaningful movement, this needs
Mm-hmm.
to, right, it was just actions, it was as action based abstract movement to create, right? It sounded like a
Yeah.
completely abstract movement generation process that then was contextualized into the learning experience. So I'm just kind of
Yeah.
mapping it out for myself in terms of why that's such a unique approach, because you weren't thinking make a dance about not hearing somebody.
Right, exactly. That, and those sometimes I find that I want to, and my students want to create dances with this symbolism for, heavy social issues and
Heavy.
social and political relevance, which is super important. But sometimes those have to percolate and they have to generate. And um, so sometimes I find that starting, like you're saying, with an action, with a movement-based concept that might on the surface, our initial entry point feels kind of neutral.
Yeah.
And then exploring out of that, well, what comes up when I do that? And then if I do that and now layer thinking about this thing over it, um, because I find that sometimes things can get very gestural and mimetic, and there's a place for that, and there certainly are students and artists and audience members who value those kinds of gestural based works. It's just not necessarily the place that I want to work in all the time. So um I think sometimes that can limit discovery because we define it from the outset. Well, this is going to mean this, and I made this about this.
Mhm.
Um, but sometimes allowing the abstraction to lead us to discovery, and so sometimes LOD can frame that
Yeah.
for me. Not always, I have lots of different tools in my toolbox, but
Yeah, you might choose the LOD concept of gesture
right.
and meaning making, right? And that could be the goal of the lesson. Like nothing is off the table, which is what's so fun about it.
Mhm.
Um, is that in every value set, and this is something especially as I teach like my students who I coach through like notating their own work, you
Mhm.
know, your value set is represented in your choices of what you're going to put on the page. So, somebody who does value specific gestures or specific shapes or specific designs or specific footwork or whatever it is that's really important to them, then that goes down on the page and then that becomes that value set. And and um and then those that are interested in the abstraction have the latitude to also represent openness and
Mhm.
and have their openness visible on the page, because I think that's another key component of representing our values for, you know to what degree of kind of uncertainty or flexibility or abstraction are we willing to hold in this artistic space? And because that's important, that
Yeah.
it's not just about the documenting of specific choices, but the choice, it could be the specific choice to be open, right? And so that becomes a value, and can be represented. So very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one if I can pick your brain
Hmm.
just about then the linking, like something that like you and I go there, it's awesome. A lot of people go there and we're like, yeah, yeah, yeah. But right, then you know, especially in my community college setting, but in any dance setting, students who have prior experiences outside of this paradigm, outside of this framework, can kind of,
Mm.
how do I feel about this?
Mm.
This can really rock my world. And so, I've learned to recognize it and say, oh wow, it could feel really different. And how does that feel? And let's acknowledge that and let's welcome that into the experience. Um and so I guess, yeah, I'm curious if you like what I witness at times in my students is that they'll go there for themselves. And then when taken out of a safe context, they go back to habit patterns that were modeled in their formative years. And so I'm curious if you've witnessed that or addressed that in your world. Um, because
Yeah.
it's something that I think those of us who are in the work, we like see these really cool changes or experiments or shifts, and it's like, oh yeah, a new world is opening up to you. And then when that context of like safety and like the safe space of whatever that class is, an improv class or whatever that class is goes away, what happens?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, part of it is for young people who are in that sort of identity formation place of like the late
Big.
teens, early 20s, which is where a lot of our college dance students are. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. Um, yeah, that fragility, anything new is still fragile knowledge, right? And not fragility in a bad
Mm.
putting down way, but just the knowledge itself is it's new, and therefore it's like a little baby chick and it's a little bit fragile. And um so a couple thoughts on that. One is I do try in teaching um, to really remind myself of the mantra experience before information. And there's a great talk that Eric Booth has. I heard him give a version of it like 20 some years ago or whatever at an arts education conference. But he's got somebody, I mentioned it to, Googled him and found a version of the talk on YouTube. I
Oh,
was like,
I
cool,
don't know
run
his.
that
I
out,
don't
right?
know more of a talk, so I'm
But
curious. Like Eric Booth, I'm like making mental note of
yeah,
it right now.
but like basically he talks about how like if we're engaging people in new ideas, that we want to provide the experience before we layer on the information.
Yeah.
So because we filter information through our own experiences, so if I can provide you with a new experience and you can trust me enough to have that experience, then you've got something to layer this information. So whenever I teach things that engage LOD, I try not to lead with the visual symbols, because that, I mean, even me, so this is a side note, a teacher is retiring and is gifting me some of her teaching resources, and she handed me the day the packet of the Rainbow Etude, and it's got the lob annotation score of the Etude based on Donald McHale's Rainbow Around My Shoulder, and
Yeah.
I can read it, but like I flipped through it and I was like and I told her, I was like, this is overwhelming me, and I actually know how to read this. So even now, like that initial panic when you see something that looks a little bit unfamiliar. So anyway, even when I'm introducing something very basic, I try to give the concepts first, and an experience that feels familiar enough but pulls people into that new concept before I layer over a lot of vocabulary about this is what it means, or visual information about this is what it might look like, or theoretical information about how it might relate to other concepts in a conceptual system, right? So that idea, and then I also try to pair a lot of my teaching with opportunities for reflection. So having the students you've experienced something, and then I've given you some information, and then we maybe go take that into another kind of experience. And then can you journal with a prompt? I don't believe in asking students to do open-ended, unfocused journaling because I hated that as a student. So there's always a prompt. You don't have to use my prompt, but I'm going to always give you one if you need
You'll
it.
always provide one.
I'll always provide the prompt. But some type of prompt, or a turn and talk, or some type of reflective opportunity. And sometimes it's a forecasting about how might this idea surface in your work, or how might you apply this, right? Now they might just walk away and forget it. But
Yeah.
at least if we have that opportunity to begin to make those linkages to our own practice. And then I think also it's just about creating as much time and space
Mhm.
to be with new ideas. If you had 14 years to be with one way of doing things, one semester of a new way. But maybe if you can keep having those, and maybe you have another semester, or you have an opportunity to work with a choreographer in a performance setting who works in another different way, um, to provide those, but then to also provide space for students to acknowledge, well, what was the value system at play in that?
Mhm.
What was the knowledge construction at play in that way that you've been working in? So it's not one or the other, but you can start to recognize that all approaches to dance have a value system at play. All approaches have a way of constructing knowledge. All approaches have a way of making meaning. And some of them make it more visible than others. Some of them language is a big deal, and some of them language is less of a big deal. Some of them physical sensation or virtuosity or community or whatever is more or less important. Um, but yeah, to value the knowledge that students bring to the table, and then invite them to consider, here's another set of tools. How might this support your aims and your goals? I find can be helpful. And I really, especially, I've come to appreciate that so much in working with teachers, because teachers don't have time. They don't have time for other stuff that doesn't help them. Um, and they've already figured out a lot about what works in their classroom and about what they want to do in their classrooms. So when I do lead PDs, it's creating samples, and here's things that you can take if you so choose and plug them into your classrooms.
Yep.
But here's also a space to think about a bigger concept and a bigger approach and bigger questions for you to start to explore as you create your own way of doing it in your classroom, whatever that it might
Yeah.
be.
So cool. Well, this has been such a joy. It's always so fun just to hear what other people are doing and grappling with and witnessing and experiencing. And so yeah, so maybe you planted it in your last little talk. I'm thinking, oh, we should talk again about assessments, because that's one thing
Oh,
that you're like queen of
oh yeah. I
assessments.
didn't even go there today. I didn't even
I
go
know. I'm
there.
like, how did we talk for an hour and assessments didn't come up? But what I appreciate is that, of course, you're not just about assessments, right? Because this, as a multifaceted thinker, what's of the moment, and then recognizing what's of the moment and going there. And so yeah, we'll have to have you back. I'll have to have you
Okay.
back just to talk about assessment and LOD,
Do that.
because you are, and it would be great. It would be fun if I had you and like Teresa Highland or something, like two like crazy assessment gurus, like in the same room. I'd be like, assessment crazed. But yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, the practicality of the language, we didn't even, that's a whole other area, but the expression and the value and the meaning making and the flexibility and the conceptual approach, all of that talk, um, I think is really rich and wonderful for people to hear. So thank you so much for spending time here
Yeah,
today and sharing. And
welcome.
and yeah, we'll be in touch with you again soon. And of course, we look forward to hearing and reading and seeing all your different projects as you move forward. So thank you so much, Marissa. It's been a joy.
Awesome. Thank you, Beth.